All right. Walking up here, I had to remind myself what I'm talking about, so I think I remember now. When I first walked in here, I looked up and I thought I was in the wrong place because I thought I saw this Roman Catholic priest talking to everyone. I almost about turned around, but I was like, it's just Jared, he's here, you know. So we do have one Anglican here, so that's good, more than normal. See, Jared is not, he's neither Lutheran nor Eastern Orthodox, which means he can take a joke. All right, so, well, anyway, thank you for being here. Thank you for coming out here. I thought I went in like 10 circles trying to get out here, and I probably did. Took twice as long as it should have. But so I was tasked to talk about Puritanism or the Puritans and the American founding. I did my dissertation on this. Please do not read my dissertation. You are not allowed to read anyone's dissertation unless you ask them first, because it's usually horrible, like mine was. But that's what I did this on, and so I should know this fairly well, hopefully. So the first thing I want to say is the word Puritan. So the word Puritan, if you went up to someone in the 17th century and you said, hey, Puritan, how you doing? Tell me about this or that. He'd probably not punch you in the face, but he would be very upset that you called him a Puritan. We, without any reservation, called them Puritans, even though back then they actually didn't like the term Puritan. And the reason for that is because, well, yeah, they would talk about pure, this and that, but they referred mainly to purity with regard to ecclesial practices or church practices or worship. And so they wanted to clear from the church the various practices they thought were either inherited from the papacy or from Roman Catholicism, or they simply thought were not commanded in Scripture. And so that's really what the pure part that's the purity part. But the other part, the sort of the idea that they want to found a society and that they want to make it pure. They're going to barge into your house, inspect to see if you're a heretic. If you say something wrong, they're going to grab you and throw you out or condemn you or execute you. That's not exactly what the Puritans believed. But the Puritan, when we even speak of Puritanism today, it's actually a broad spectrum of different positions. There were some people who were, you could say Puritan, but still wanted to remain in the Church of England, and who kind of conformed. In a way, they were conformist, even though in principle they didn't agree with it. There were others who were nonconformists, who were actually tolerated for a while in the Church of England, but when they were not tolerated, they were then dismissed, and many of those people, such as John Cotton, then traveled to the New World. And there are others who are actually more separatists. They're more, you could say, the extreme group. They would be typically known as the Pilgrims who came over in the Mayflower. They would be more of the extreme version who really wanted to have nothing at all to do with the Church of England. So it actually is a broad spectrum. It's hard to define. It's hard to nail down this person is the Puritan and this person is not. But nevertheless, I'm going to use Puritan. And the other thing I want to say is that, so the topic is Puritans and the American founding. I want to say kind of up front that I don't think there is a clear line, direct line of intellectual thought that is distinctly Puritan that came to influence the founding, broadly speaking. So you're wondering, what am I going to talk about today, right? But I don't think there was a certain work that is like that influenced the founding and these other works did not. I actually think that the Western tradition influenced the founders, and in particular the Anglo-Protestant tradition, which includes Anglicans, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, all sorts of different people, including individuals like John Locke and what we usually consider Enlightenment figures. There was a broad range of influences, and many of the ideas of the Puritans with regard to politics were not actually unique to them. There was a broad discussion going on for centuries, even prior to the landing in the mid-17th century. And so there's no clear, I would say, and I'm curious if others here who are who study this stuff would disagree. I don't think there's a Puritan thought that directly goes to the founding. So really what was occurring in the 17th century and the 18th century up to the founding was a transatlantic discussion. Okay, transatlantic meaning that it's in the New World, it's in the Old World, Many of the books from the New World written in, say, Boston, when they wrote them, were actually published in England. So, and they would be published there first and then make their way to England or to New England. And so this is really a discussion between, French theorists and Dutch theorists and Scottish and English and who am I missing? Many others, okay? And so it's just a broad discussion going on that influenced the founders. Though I do think there is something about Puritanism, and I will explain that, how it influenced the founding in a certain way. The other thing is Protestantism. I want to say that the American founding was distinctly Protestant. Now, Protestant can be Presbyterian, Anglican, Baptist, all sorts of different things. One of the fundamental features of Protestantism is that your true faith, you being united to Christ, is not based upon you being in the right institution. That is the outward institution. So in Roman Catholicism, you're in the church if you're in that centralized church called centralized in Rome. You're baptized into it. You are a Christian because you're in that ecclesial institution, and that institution to this day claims for itself to be the only true church of Christ. But in Protestantism, you are united to Christ by faith, and faith is it's an internal reality. That is, you exercise faith as an individual, and therefore you are in the church of Christ or the kingdom of Christ by faith. What this means then is that you can be a member of you can be Presbyterian, you can be Congregationalist, you can be Baptist, you can be in different institutions, and yet we can all acknowledge each other's mutual faith. So you just see what we have here. I believe we have 3 Presbyterian speakers, 1 Anglican, and 1 Baptist. Did I get that right? And all of us would acknowledge each other's mutual faith. Some of us are in different denominations of Presbyterianism, and of course, Baptist and Anglican. So the basis for us to say you are a brother in Christ is a shared faith. It's not a shared institution. Now, that's really crucial to understand the development of political life, particularly in the New World. What that means, and this is what I'm going to argue, is that as we interact with each other, as we live with each other, as we experience civil order and civil polity together, we can then come to form a pan-Protestant nation. So it goes from a Congregationalist New England, and eventually, of course, there's Anglicanism in the South, as Jared said, but we can then acknowledge each other's mutual faith, and we can form a nation as brothers, as fellow Protestants, and not worry as much about differing institutions. And so what this means then is that religious liberty, that is the acknowledging that fellow Protestants, that we can live peaceably with fellow Protestants, is not a violation of Christian principles. It's not a violation of Protestant principles. It's actually affirms the principles, and then over time, over the centuries, we Protestants said, hey, I guess we could get along. And really, the composition of this room reflects that fact. So there have been in the past, church-state relations such that people were excluded from essentially having their own churches according to their own conscience. And yet over time, that was able to develop. Okay, so that's kind of my argument in a nutshell, and I'll get through that. So when the founding of Boston, so I'm going to center on New England, particularly in Massachusetts. They came in the late 1620s to Boston, to Massachusetts, to form the Massachusetts Bay Colony, to form it along Congregationalist lines. Now, if you're Baptist, you think, oh, that's great. But actually, they were Paedo-Baptist, infant baptizers. They did believe the state could act against heretics. But what they meant is that we, as what they were also called in England as independents, are going to found this colony around that sort of arrangement. And that's what they did. And what it meant is that the individual churches within Boston are in a way independent. That is, they are congregationally led. And yet they also acknowledged, as I said, that the civil magistrate can act against heretics, they can suppress that sort of thing. So it's not exactly what you think as a sort of proto-Baptist political thought, but that's what they came to do. And that was their intent. They're saying, we as a body politic are going to form this society around our understanding of the church, okay? Now, things didn't go exactly as planned, as you might know from history. So what I want to do is outline 4 different incidents, and I think in a way set the record straight on what each of those incidents entailed. So the first one is going to be, the beloved Roger Williams. It's going to be Roger Williams, Antinomians, Quakers, and then the anti-Paedo-Baptists, also known as the Baptists, okay? So Roger Williams, I have said publicly that Roger Williams is a nut, and I will not take that back. Everyone thinks that Roger Williams is a great religious freedom fighter. Actually, he was the most extreme possible Puritan you could be. And he was not actually kicked out. He was not banished from Boston because of his views on religious toleration. I know that's what all the books say, but I'm here to tell you that's not true. Actually, Roger Williams was banished for reasons you may not actually 100% expect. There was a series of replies from Roger Williams to John Cotton. John Cotton was a Congregationalist minister in New England, in Boston. And John Cotton says that Roger Williams was kicked out for mainly 2 reasons. One is Roger Williams said that the charter, or the patent that led to the creation of the colony itself, was invalid. It was unlawful. It was unjust. Right? So that means that the very foundation of Massachusetts Bay Colony was being called into question by this influential minister. So in John Cotton's words, he said that it would subvert the fundamental state and the government of the country. So that's the first one. So you have a fledgling society. It's only a few years old. You have all these people who showed up to do this thing, and now it's all being called into question by this very influential preacher, namely Roger Williams. So you have to picture yourself in this time. You're in the wilderness. You're trying to build this thing. Now everything's being called into question. The other issue, which is related, is that the civil magistrates said, hey, you guys need to take a civil loyalty oath. They were worried about, they thought there was a rumor of a bishop running around, and so they wanted a loyalty oath for people within Boston, within Massachusetts. And Roger Williams said that actually that is a violation of the third commandment, namely that you are using the civil office to have them do a swear an oath, which is third commandment. That's religious. That's your duty to God. You can't actually do that. And so what they said then, the civil authorities, before they banished him, they said that he is dangerous because his ideas tended to unsettle all the kingdoms and commonwealths of Europe. So in the background for all of these incidents is the fear of the Anabaptists. Okay, so the Anabaptists in Europe in the 16th century were notorious for undermining civil cities, magistrates, laws. And so they all had that history in their mind of these Anabaptists showing up and causing problems and trying to overthrow the state. And they saw in Roger Williams that exact sort of temperament and his ideas. And so they said, you know what, Roger, you're out. So they banished him and he left. He later claimed that it was because of his religious opinions of toleration, that's why he was kicked out. But that's actually denied. And John Cotton says, actually, there are people who hold Roger Williams' views in our own churches. So in other words, you can believe what Roger Williams believes regarding toleration and be a member of our churches, that is the established churches. Okay? So that was the story of Roger Williams. I think that's something that needs to be corrected. And the other issue, too, is Roger Williams despised Anglicans. He despised the Church of England, and he called for excommunication of anyone who temporarily went back to England, worshipped in a Church of England church, and then comes back. And actually, John Cotton, the notorious Puritan, said, actually, we believe that the Church of England and the individual churches of the Church of England are typically true gospel churches with true ministers, with true sacraments, and the preaching of the gospel from the pulpit. So actually the Puritan ministers of New England affirmed that the various churches of the Church of England were true churches, but Roger Williams did not believe that. So it was another way in which he caused trouble. Now, what you notice here is that the concern for Roger Williams was not over the religious view, his religious views. The principal concern was his views would cause civil disruption, undermine obedience to the laws and magistrates. It would undermine generally the discipline of the people in this fledgling colony. So it was a civil matter. It wasn't persecution for his religious opinions. It was over this fledgling society trying to maintain itself. All right, so that's Roger Williams. Now, I did say that people who had his opinions were allowed into the established churches. Now, why is that? Well, that's because even though the church ministers, namely John Cotton and others, thought that he was in error, they still affirmed that these people can be true Christians and affirm religious toleration. And the duty of a church as a sort of outpost of the kingdom of God is to administer word and sacrament to true believers. And so it would be wrong for them, despite the differences on that opinion, it would be wrong for them to deny those people who qualify in doctrine of life to be in that church. So you have people of different opinions in the Puritan church. They were not being run out because of different opinions. All right, the next one is the Antinomians, Antinomianism. So that's another broad set of beliefs. Antinomians tended to, in the extreme versions, reject the idea of active participation in your sanctification, so that you wouldn't strive after holiness. That's kind of the extreme version of it. And the famous people involved with this, the one famous person is Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson. The person you may not know is another guy named John Wheelwright. So what was happening, another person you might not realize who was accused of antinomianism is John Cotton himself. John Cotton came over to the New World, and guess who followed him, thinking that he was a free grace preacher? Well, Anne Hutchinson is the one who followed John Cotton to the New World. And so all this started by another minister accusing John Cotton of being an antinomian. And so there's all these letters that are being passed around, and they're all sort of public. John Cotton's responding to it. In the meantime, after John Cotton would give a sermon, Anne Hutchinson would invite people to her house, and they would discuss the sermon. She was influenced by antinomians in England, and so pretty soon a sort of clique arose from that, from, in a way, her ministry. And from there you get a rising antinomianism in Boston. So this is alarming, and then John Cotton actually steps back and says, I don't believe any of that stuff. But John Wheelwright, this other minister, becomes the quintessential antinomian of Boston. Now, just like the normal practice in the Reformed tradition is that if there's some kind of ecclesial, like there's some sort of issue occurring or some teaching that people don't agree with, what they do is the ministers deal with it first. This is also true if a heretic shows up. So Servetus shows up to Geneva. Calvin tries to persuade Servetus to stop being anti-Trinitarian. The same thing in New England. The ministers are arguing with one another, and it hits a sort of boiling point. And so the civil authorities step in, and they say, okay, we're going to have a fast day. We're going to have a day of fast. Everyone's, going to do a fast on this day. And it happened to be on a Sunday. Okay? It happened to be on a Sunday. Now, John Wheelwright took advantage of this situation, and he gave a sermon that seemed to suggest, and I've read the sermon, it seemed to suggest that all the other ministers are false teachers, all the other churches are false churches, the civil magistrates, many of them are false Christians. And so he seemed to now say that our entire society, all the churches are no longer Christian. Well, you see why that might be a problem in a society like this. And so then they acted, the civil authorities then acted upon, and brought Hutchinson and Wheelwright, and they were subsequently banished. All right. Now, The official account of this from the New England side is written by a man named John Winthrop. You've probably heard of him. He says this. He states that this case was not a matter of conscience, but of a civil nature. He says the wars in Germany for these hundreds of years arose from dissensions in religion, and though in the beginning of the contention they drew out only the sword of the Spirit, yet it was soon changed into a sword of steel. So what they saw within the spirit of the Antinomians was that this is going to turn into violence, bloodshed. And so what do? They root out the cause, namely these two individuals. And Hutchinson, as her family, was subsequently killed by Indians. And Wheelwright, he was not killed, but he went off to do his thing. So when Cotton Mather, decades later, around 1700, writing about this, he was against killing heretics. Oh, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's about Quakers. Quakers! We'll talk about Quakers now. But for the Antinomians, the point about that is that they acted against them. It was a civil nature. They were concerned about the order of society, and they thought that Antinomianism would, and the spirit of them would end up undermining that society, and so they acted on them for that reason. Now, you might not agree with that, but their version of the events is that it was not about an opinion. It was not about them thinking some thought. It was that their actions and those views would undermine the project that they came out to establish. That is the body politic. All right. So now Quakers were also nuts. Now, when we think of Quakers now, we think of these nice people. They tend to be liberal. Whatever. They tend to be nice people. But back then, they were actually kind of crazy. They really were crazy. Samuel Sowell, who was a merchantman in New England, wrote a diary entry where he describes a woman in like a sack. She was like wearing a sack or something like that. That's all she was wearing. She had blackface, so she had like tar or something all over her face. And she rushes into the church in the middle of the sermon and starts screaming insults at the minister and everyone around her. And then other people run in too and do the same thing. That's just one example of many of what Quakers would do in various places all across the New World and also in England. Now, when they would do these things, they would be apprehended and they'd be banished. And then they'd come back. The same people come back. They'd do all that stuff again, then they'd be banished. And then they'd come back. Banished, come back. Literally 4 or 5 times, the same people did not get the hint that we don't want them here. And they could have gone to places like Rhode Island. But they keep coming back. So eventually, the Massachusetts said, okay, if you come back again, we're actually going to execute you. This is going too far. They come back again, and they give them clemency. They say, okay, we're not going to kill you this time. And then the Quakers come back again, do their same sort of babbling nonsense everywhere, and then there's the execution of 2 people. Now, you can, of course, disagree with that, the execution of those people, but let's not pretend these Quakers are normal sort of people. They should not have been there in the first place. And so even Cotton Mather, who's considered a very balanced guy, he was against what he called hereticide, that is killing heretics, but he said that they manifested an intolerable contempt of authority and needlessly pulled upon themselves a vengeance. Okay? So that's what happened with the Quakers. It wasn't that they showed up, they have different opinions, the Puritans didn't like it, they apprehended them, then they killed them. That's not what happened with them. All right, so now the last one is the Baptists. I'm guessing there's mostly Baptists here, so this will be fun. In the Baptist imagination, there's always someone about to persecute you around the corner. They're just ready to come in. There's people out there I haven't planned out. All right, so go back to what I said, that you have these Congregationalists. They are Paedo-Baptists. They go to New England, and they create this colony along those lines. Okay. Now, we all know the idea of outsiders coming in. Why are these Baptists entering into our society? Now, many of them were actually allowed to coexist for many decades in Boston without any sort of harassment. They just couldn't establish their own churches. They could actually be members of the Congregationalist churches. There were Baptists in Increase Mather's church. They were Baptist in John Cotton's church. They were permitted, despite their differences, to be members of the church. And why is that? Well, because it goes back to the Protestant principle that it's an inward faith. Baptist, even though we disagree on baptism, you nevertheless are a believer. You're a fellow Christian united to Christ. We're an outpost of the kingdom, namely word and sacrament. You can join our church. In a way, you have a right to it if you meet the sort of doctrine and life qualifications for that. And so they did. They were members of the church. But around, it was in the mid 1670s, this sort of thing came to the boiling point again, where Baptist churches now would just spring up. There'd be one or two Baptist churches here or there. And the first outrage on the Congregationalist side was that the Baptists are now admitting to membership those who were excommunicated by the established church. So that was one of the big controversies. And there was this guy, one of the guys, his name was John Russell. John Russell was a Baptist, and I believe he became a church officer at the Baptist church in Boston. Okay, he writes, this is the pattern that happens all throughout the 17th century. He feels persecuted. He writes what's called the narrative. It gets published in England. It gets circulated in England first. Everyone in England freaks out because now they're persecuting the Baptists. And then New England writes its reply. And the reply is written by a man named Samuel Willard, another man I already mentioned, Increase Mather. Okay, here's some things that Increase Mather said. He said that in all his time in Boston, he says that the Baptists were never persecuted because of their error about the subject of baptism. Okay, he says he never witnessed it simply because of their different belief. So someone says, I believe in believer baptism or credo baptism. They did not consider that enough for them to be banished or punished or anything like that. They just were not allowed, as I said, to have their own churches. He said that he never saw, quote, any of those that scruple infant baptism met with molestation from the magistrate merely on the account of their opinion. And then he says, he would speak to them as unto brethren, and he says, whom I love. So this Increase Mather who's saying, Baptists, you cannot have your own churches, but you can be in our churches. You are brethren, and I love you, like your fellow brethren. Now, why wouldn't they have their own churches? Why wouldn't they allow that? Now, it was not because they thought those would be false churches. There's no indication that they believe that a Baptist church is a false church. The reason why they wouldn't let a Baptist church be erected is that the Baptists, given their view of baptism, would basically see everyone who's baptized as an infant as having an invalid baptism. And if baptism is closely tied to you being a Christian, then it calls it to question whether you're a Christian at all. It calls the question as to whether your church practicing infant baptism is a true church. And also it means that if you're baptized as an infant and you attend a Baptist church, you may not be allowed to participate in the Lord's Supper. All right, so these Baptist churches then, by their very nature and by their theology, call into question the Christianity of the entire society that's already been created. Okay, they call into question everyone's true faith. And they're trying to create a body politic in the congregational way. You can see how Baptists who were not invited to be there in the first place, creating a church could cause problems. And what happens is once you allow some Baptists to come in, they all show up. And so eventually you get more and more of them show up. And it would undermine the very thing that they were trying to do from the beginning. So it was a civil concern, primarily, that they were undermining the project. And the thing is the Congregationalist churches could reciprocate. They could acknowledge the Baptist true baptism because Paedo-Baptists also baptize adults. So that means the Baptist church, in their presence, The infant Baptist can acknowledge your baptism, right? They can acknowledge that you're a true minister of the word. They can acknowledge that the Lord's Supper is a true sacrament or ordinance or whatever. They can acknowledge that to you. But the Baptist churches cannot reciprocate that. They cannot turn around and look at the infant Baptist church and say that they are doing the Lord's Supper properly, because what are they doing? They're feeding it to people who are not actually baptized properly, not only illicitly, but invalid baptism. And so this was Cotton Mather's concern in 1700. Let's see if I can find that somewhere. He says, for himself, Baptists can enjoy all the ordinance and fellowship of our churches, right? But he says that for them, the Credo Baptist would unchurch all the faithful upon the earth beside themselves, because they'd mark themselves off as visible saints. Think of like the regenerate church model. They declared infant baptism to be a mere nullity, and with them, therefore, our churches were no churches of the Lord Jesus Christ, nor are there any visible saints among us. So that's the issue. I think that a lot of people, not just Baptists, everyone is told that the Baptists show up, they have a different view of baptism, and the Puritans grab them, torture them, whatever, and kick them out, simply for that opinion itself. But historically, that does not seem to be the case. Historically, it was because there's no reciprocation of Christianity. There's no reciprocation of ecclesial unity, or that sort of thing. That was the issue. More and more Baptists come to New England, and it undermines precisely what they're trying to do. So Increase Mather responds to these people, and he says, should men of any other persuasion whatsoever have done the like, the same severity would have been used towards them. If any men, either of the Presbyterian or congregational persuasion, in matters referring to church discipline, should behave themselves as the Anabaptists in Boston, in New England, have done, I think they would have deserved far greater punishment than anything that to this day had been inflicted upon them. So Increase Mather is actually saying, if the Presbyterians did that, they would deserve punishment as well. And so it's not as if they're pointing out simply the Baptists. It's anyone who had done that. And there's another quote I wanted. It's kind of a long one, but this is this really important quote from Increase Mather I want to read. He says, "It is evident that toleration is in one place not only lawful but a necessary duty." So toleration is not only lawful, but it's a necessary duty, which in another place would be destructive, and the expectation of it irrational. That which is needful to ballast a great ship will sink a small boat. If a considerable number of anti-Paedo Baptists should obtain liberty from the state to transport themselves and family into a vast American wilderness, that so they might be a peculiar people by themselves, practicing all and only the institutions of Christ, if now Paedo Baptists should come after them and intrude themselves upon them, and when they cast men out of their society for moral scandals, entertain them, surely they would desire such persons either to walk orderly with them or return to the place from whence they came. And if they would do neither, they would think that such Paedo Baptists were blameworthy. Let them then do as they would be done by, and deal by us as they would have us to deal by them. Were they in our case and we in theirs. In other words, if the Baptists decided to organize themselves and get together and show up and move into the wilderness and start this Baptist society, and Paedo Baptists looked at that and said, that's kind of nice, I'm going to go move in there. And they start trying to subvert the foundation, the intent of that political order. That would have been wrong for the Paedo Baptists to do that. And so Increase Mather says, therefore, it's also the problem. It's also at fault for the Baptists for doing that. Now, the other thing about that, I said in my book that quote is a strikingly Christian nationalist statement of my understanding of it, which is that you have a particular people with a particular way of life, and that particular way of life ought to be preserved. It ought to be guarded. He's saying that we of this certain persuasion formed a society, and people should not enter into it such that they would subvert it. All right. So anyway, that's the Baptist. That's the Baptist Now, you can disagree with all the reasoning they had about that, but I think it's important to correct the record that it was not simply, you won't baptize infants, I'm going to kick you out for that. Now, I don't know how much time I have left. Oh my goodness. Okay, I haven't even got to the founding yet. Okay, drink your coffee. All right, so you jump ahead a few more years. It's 1718. So this is about almost 40 years since Increase Mather wrote that. Increase Mather is still alive. Cotton Mather is now kind of the leading minister of Boston. And Cotton Mather, who is a Congregationalist, is now giving the ordination sermon for a Baptist minister in the First Baptist Church of Boston. So 35 years later, something changed. Something changed. So now you have Cotton Mather giving this sermon that's installing a Baptist minister in a Baptist church. In the audience with him is Increase Mather, Cotton's father. So something changed. The question is, what actually changed? Now, I don't think actually any principles changed. I don't think any idea in itself changed. I think what happened is, over time, the Congregationalists and the Baptists recognized that, you know what, you can have your churches and we can get along. We can actually form a body politic around a shared Protestantism. And again, that's not a violation of principle. They're not changing anything that John Cotton said. What they're saying is that actually the civil concerns that we had in the 1670s and the 1640s and 50s over people like yourself, we no longer find those concerning. We no longer think that it's necessary to suppress Baptists in their churches. We can actually affirm toleration, and actually we can get along quite well as brothers in the same civil society. So again, it's not a change of principle. It's actually the application of the Protestant principle, which is that you're not a Christian by your institutional affiliation. You're a Christian by your true faith in Christ. All right, so that's 1718. Now let's get to the founding. Now what I think the founding represents with regard to religious liberty, it is the culmination of Anglo-Protestant experience. Okay, it's the culmination of Anglo-Protestant experience. The notions of religious liberty at that time were not, Enlightenment liberalism. They were not any sort of abstract idea. What they were is a recognition of a shared Protestantism, and that we can form a civil society with differences and get along and be both brothers in Christ and fellow brothers of a nation without any sort of restriction on religious opinion. So that's my contention of what actually happened. It wasn't centrally philosophy. It wasn't abstract thought. It wasn't enlightenment thinking. It was a unfolding of Protestant principles through experience. That is the experience of people over generations coming to acknowledge each other as fellow Christians and members of the same political project. I will say, though, in terms of religious liberty for the founders, is practically all of them believed that religion, that is true religion, the Christian religion, was necessary for political happiness, for civil happiness, for the happiness of a nation. Even the ones who believed in strict separation of church and state, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, those guys all affirmed that you need religion to promote virtue and happiness in a society. Madison, near the end of his life in the 1830s, he wrote a letter to another man, and he said, look, we disestablished the churches and religion is flourishing. I was right. Because he was writing in the 1780s that, if we disestablish, religion will actually flourish more. So he thought that it confirmed his view. But his point was not, hey, let's get religion entirely out of the nation. His point was that if we disestablish, that is, we don't have an institutional affiliation between an ecclesial institution, and the civil government, religion will flourish. That was Madison's point. He thought he was right about that. So the majority opinion was actually on the side of a sort of establishment. But the point is that both of them saw the same end. The same end was actually flourishing religion, which was necessary for happiness. And I mean, the people who affirm this, you got John Adams, Benjamin Rush, Gouverneur Memorius, Roger Sherman, Alexander Hamilton, James Wilson, George Washington, John Hancock, all those guys believed strongly that religion was necessary. Just take John Witherspoon. He says, if virtue and piety are inseparably connected, then to promote true religion is the best and most effectual way of making a virtuous and regular people. Love to God and love to man is the substance of religion. When these prevail, civil laws will have little to do. That is, you won't need coercion, because if you have religion, people will be naturally virtuous. You won't have as much need for coercion. All right. I'm assuming Zach will talk more about Witherspoon, so I don't want to. And the Baptist. I have all these things about different folks, but even like Elisha Williams and Isaac Backus, the famous religious liberty guys. If you read their arguments for the religious liberty, they're assuming Protestant principles. Like they're assuming Protestant statements in their argumentation. Again, the whole thing, the whole background of the entire discussion between disestablishment and establishment, both of them were using Protestant reasons to argue for their position. The whole thing, the whole background was Protestantism. All right. One thing I want to point out is I guess I'm a bit unorganized. I'm in a Baptist church after all. You can be an organized Baptist church. I don't mean that. Forget it. So John Adams, of course, he was a Massachusetts native. He kind of descended into Unitarianism, unfortunately, but it was still retained some of his forefathers' ideas with regard to religion and political life. He wrote the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. And in that Constitution, it says that man has a right and a duty to worship the supreme being. It's actually in the Constitution of Massachusetts, 1780. In there, he says that you are allowed full toleration of your opinion as long as you don't disrupt and fight with another denomination. So there is a recognition of toleration with the proviso that says you are not allowed to undermine the good order of society and harass others. And also in there, it says, oh, by the way, you have to pay a tax which will go to the denomination of your choice, and that will fund ministers and churches. And that was the most common view of the founding period. That was the majority opinion. That's what George Washington believed. That's what John Adams believed, what John Witherspoon believed. All these guys believed that you could be taxed and that would be funneled to the denomination of your choice. And if you didn't designate a denomination, it would go to the established church of that state. That was very common throughout all of the colonies and well into the 19th century at the state level. Now, the people who are of the minority view would be the people who hear about a lot, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. I think it's important to note that Madison's writings on religious liberty were not heavily cited. In fact, they weren't cited much at all until the mid-20th century. So James Madison's views on church-state relations were not significant according to the Supreme Court until the Warren Court in the mid-20th century. Same thing with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, in fact, was not even in the country when the First Amendment was written, when it was deliberated upon, or when it was ratified. He was in Paris. Even though he did write letters to people, and perhaps he influenced someone like James Madison, the actual, I think Jared mentioned Fisher Ames was on the committee to write the First Amendment. That also included James Madison, but also included a man named Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman was described by John Adams as being that old Puritan, which was actually it wasn't deriding him, but Roger Sherman wrote the laws of Connecticut when they did a revision, and that included language that looks very much like what John Adams said in the Massachusetts Constitution. Namely, you can have full toleration for people who comport themselves properly, and also there's going to be a tax that's redistributed to your church of choice. So that was just a common view. And so the First Amendment, as Jared said, applied to the federal government. I always ask people, what is the first word of the First Amendment? Can anyone say what the first word? First word of the First Amendment is Congress. What does Congress refer to? It refers to Congress established in the federal Constitution. And that's how it was understood until the 1960s or the late 50s. And it was understood that applied only to the federal government. The states had the right to regulate religion according to their own laws and their own constitution. All right? So that's what the First Amendment meant. And what that reflects then, it reflects the recognition that religion should not be in, the federal government should not have a role in religion. They have Anglicans in Virginia, you have Congregationalists in Connecticut and Massachusetts, you have Roman Catholics in Maryland, you have Quakers and Anglicans in Pennsylvania. It wouldn't be appropriate for there to be religion, a denominational religion mandated from the federal government, but all the states can retain their rights and powers regarding regulating religion as they saw fit. That's all the First Amendment meant. And in fact, if you read the writings of the Anti-Federalists, that's what they were concerned with. They were concerned with there being a bishop or something, an established church at the national level, which would then interfere with all the religious liberties of what the states enjoyed individually. And so that's the first. So here's the point. So I can end it now, in my ramblings now. The founding era, as I said, was the culmination, I think, of Anglo-Protestant experience, meaning that it went from church establishments in New England and other places in the South, and then fellow Protestants could get together in a framing convention and produce a constitution. Protestants of different persuasions could do this together, and they could affirm each other's mutual faith, and they could say, we as a country are a Protestant country, and our liberties are tied to our Protestantism, because the principles of Protestantism permit the sort of development that we enjoy now, that we can have ordered liberty amid diversity of religious opinion. And so what this means is that this is that era and what they believed, that's our inheritance as a people. It's not mere abstract thought or philosophy or Enlightenment reasoning that can float around universally, that we can bomb Iraq and suddenly they're all free because they have the right ideas. No, it's actually a development of a people with strife, with conflict, but also with resolution. And so it's a development of a particular people, and it's something we have inherited. As Americans, we've inherited that American tradition. And so as I say in my book, we can then use that as a distinctly Christian, American Christian nationalist, or whatever you want to call it, revival. Like we can renew this country and have a Christian nation, have a Christian people, restore proper toleration, proper religious liberty. We can affirm ourselves as Christian, as Protestants, and we can move forward to revitalize our country. So thank you.